Hey,
Hi, we're back. How are you?
I'm good. It feels so long when I don't, because I don't see you except the first Wednesday of the month. I
I
mean,
know.
I see you other places, but I just mean for the live streams.
No, I know. It's so weird. And I was just thinking this morning, I was like, oh my gosh, it feels like it's been forever. And then the next live stream will be early March and I'll have twins. So here we
Oh
are.
my God. How
Yeah,
you feeling?
I am here. I am feeling okay. Not great, as y'all can tell. I don't like, this is the best you get of me right now. So I am here. I'm excited for the live stream. That's what matters most. How are you?
I'm good. It's so funny because like anytime I have a friend that's pregnant and I see them, they're like, "Oh, you are getting like the raw and the unfiltered," and I'm like, "Liz, do you understand how I would be or any other man would be if we were pregnant? Like the second day I found out was pregnant, I would stop working. I would want to be like waited on hand and feet. I wouldn't go anywhere. I'd use my pregnancy as like a reason to not exist for like 9 months, even if it was like 3 weeks in.
I
So
hear that. It's interesting though, because I feel like everyone says to me like, take off, rest. And the reality is like you can't rest. Like you're uncomfortable no matter what. So you might as well work and keep your mind busy, right? It kind of reminds me of OCD where it's like sitting around ruminating doesn't make it any better. Like, let's get going and get active.
yeah, no, I'm sure. I mean, like anything, right? Time always flies when you're active. And
Yeah.
I'm sure just seeing friends and family being pregnant, my sister, as you know, had twins, and just her being in pain, like, she actually liked working because she's like, it gives me something to do. It keeps me busy. Like, I get to like be active in my mind somewhere else. She's like, when I'm at home, I'm just thinking about how uncomfortable I am and how badly I just want them to get out of my stomach.
Exactly. How are you? Obviously I think it's important for us to take a second with everything going on in California and just check in.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, a good friend of ours lost her home. Somebody on the board of directors lost their home, and I've been in contact with her, and I've had friends and family lose homes and stuff. And now we're in the rebuilding phase. I mean, it was very scary. Obviously, the fires just got put out. I mean, I think that's what people forget is it took almost a month for these fires to get put out. So at least we know there's going to be no more loss. That's the good thing. And now it's really rebuilding. It's just people that have lost everything they know. I was talking to a client yesterday who lost their home, and they were just saying like, now what? I mean, they don't have any of their baby pictures. They don't have any of their like family heirlooms. They don't have any of that. It's going to take a while for insurance to pay them back and stuff. So I think right now people are just rebuilding. And obviously there's been a lot of the Grammys just happened on Sunday, and there's a lot of money raised for fire relief. They had the concert on last Thursday for fire relief. So the good thing is people are donating, people are giving their time, and it's helping rebuild. But I mean, you think about Hurricane Katrina, you think about the fires in Maui, you think about what happened in North Carolina. I mean, it takes so long for people to get everything back. So my heart goes out to everybody that's gone through any kind of tragedy. But, right now we're just in the rebuild phase and getting, people back to some normalcy, which I think is most important.
That's it. It takes time. And obviously living in a city where we're impacted a lot by hurricanes and
Yeah,
different things,
you guys. Yeah.
it's just tough. It's hard to see, it's hard to fathom. And I think that in this case, when there was just not warning for most people and they had to get out quick, I just can't imagine. So just something for us to be always thinking about and talking about, and recognizing that, OCD and anxiety doesn't obviously, like, it always continues to increase for different folks at different times, but we certainly see when things like this are happening, right? OCD, mental health, stress certainly can be exacerbated.
100%. And I think that's it too, right? Like, part of what we've been talking about in my support groups, because my support groups, two of them are virtual. So people are from all over, and people, whether it's the fires or other things that people have gone through. And that's what we really talked about. I mean, at the end of the day, OCD thinks it's helping out and it's preparing you for anything that could potentially go wrong. But in real life, it's like things go wrong, things go bad, and it's less about trying to predict the future and prevent bad things from happening. It's trusting that you're going to land on your feet and you and your support system will figure it out. So I think that's something to remind yourself, that OCD markets itself as like a helpful tool, but it really just makes us exacerbated and tired. And then when real problems exist or happen, we weren't any more prepared simply because we ruminated about it. So I think that's something important for people to remember.
100%. So, in our thoughts and prayers, and as
Thank
always,
you.
though, we will hop into today. So, as you guys know, today's live stream is intended to be educational, supportive, and hopefully helpful to different degrees. But of course, we should not be replacing therapy, and we are not a crisis hotline. So, the International OCD Foundation does not serve as a crisis hotline. If you're feeling unsafe or suicidal, please call 988 or follow your local emergency services. Really excited to be here. As always, please submit questions live. You can do that in the right-hand pane of your screen. And then, of course, anything we don't get to, we try our best to get to in the future. And we also have pre-submitted questions, so we will bounce back and forth. But Chris, the first question that was submitted that we'll hop to at 10:51 from Kay is, if an obsession comes to mind, should I write it down? Should I not write it down? What do I do?
It was funny that you say that. Thanks for the question, Kay. We were having this discussion at my group this week. Somebody was instructed by their previous therapist who didn't have specialty in OCD to write down their obsessions. So any major obsession to write down. And I think the reason that many clinicians may recommend that who don't have specialty in OCD is because often when people are having generalized anxiety, or somebody who doesn't have any condition is having trouble sleeping, sometimes writing out what issues are going on, kind of putting it in a journal and saying, okay, I'll deal with that in the morning, can be helpful. This is what I want you to think about, Kay. The job that you and your clinician and your support system are trying to do is help show you that there is not a real problem. There is nothing going on in your life that is worth spending hours ruminating about, avoidance and compulsing. So if writing down your obsessions is strictly just to kind of get them down and write them down, the problem is I see clients that have lists and lists of every thought that they've had, and it just gives value to it. The only time we really want you to write down any kind of obsessions is because we want to sort of, as clinicians, understand what's happening to you, right? So in the beginning of treatment, you may write down your obsessions, your major worries, etc. So we as clinicians can help build a treatment plan for you. So if a client's coming in and has harm around their daughter, I need to know what their content is, especially in the beginning, so we can understand how it impacts them. But writing it down, especially compulsive, is just going to give validity to them. And unless there's a reason that you and a mental health provider are having you do it, I would caution you, because it can get compulsive and it can validate these thoughts.
100%. I think the question I always ask folks when they're asking me, should I do this or not, is what is the function,
Yeah.
right? If the function is to make you feel better, it serves as reassurance, it's some sort of ritual, then it's actually not going to be helpful, right? It's going to perpetuate the cycle. But if the function is, oh, this would actually be really hard for me, this is an exposure, writing it down is something I would want to avoid, maybe it actually could be useful.
Mm-hmm.
Next question, which is the most important question you can get when we're talking about ERP at 10:59, is, can you please explain in detail about response prevention? And I just want to tee this up before we hop in, but you guys, this is the most important piece of ERP therapy. I will ask people all the time, what do you think the most effective treatment is for OCD when I'm doing trainings to clinicians? And people will say CBT, they'll say exposure therapy. And the reality is that those are actually not evidence-based, the most effective intervention for OCD. CBT alone is not what treats OCD. Exposure therapy alone is not what treats OCD. It has to be exposure with response prevention, which, for those of you that are like, wait a second, I thought CBT was, ERP is a part of CBT. So yes, it still falls in that umbrella, but CBT interventions alone are often things like thought challenging or cognitive distortion work and some cognitive therapy work that can be useful in helping you detach or differentiate from your OCD, but they're not going to treat OCD. It has to be ERP. So Chris, let's talk about, and if you can spend some time just talking about the value of response prevention, but also when individuals do exposures without response prevention, what ends up happening?
Yeah, I will always remember when I was trained early on in ERP from Alec Pollard, was one of the people that I took a training from, the BTTI. And I remember that he used to always say, it's okay to have a little E. I don't know how this works backwards, a little E and a big RP. Response prevention, I believe, is the most important part. And especially if you're operating from an inhibitory learning standpoint. If you make the choice to do an E, which we want you to, right? And often an E sounds scary in exposure, but typically that E is something that is part of your value system, something you care about. So if I have harm thoughts around a nephew, the exposure is to spend time around that nephew. That's values-based, that's excited. but how I react to the anxiety, to the discomfort, to the thoughts, to the feelings, to the sensation is so important in teaching my brain, hey, this is something that I want to do. This is something that I'm learning I can do. I trust that I can handle this, right? If I show up and I do the exposure part, but I don't do response prevention, while I'm there, I'm asking my family for reassurance. I'm consistently checking my groinal area and my sensations in my body. I'm leaving and coming back, leaving and coming back. I go home. I start to ruminate. I'm looking up stuff. I'm sending extremely mixed signals to my rational brain. Wait a second, Chris decided to go spend time with his nephew, but it was horrific. Therefore, Chris must be someone bad. There must be something bad about that situation. Why in the heck would he ever put himself back in that situation? And now the next time I spend time around my nephew, I'm going to be more angst because last time my brain remembers that it was such a horrific part. So if I'm not ready to be around my nephew without doing response prevention, one of the most crucial parts of ERP, we can work up to that. We can do things like going to a store and being around other kids that may not have that same emotional charge because I'm practicing that response prevention. I'm engaging in things. I'm being focused outward. I'm stopping the mental compulsions. I'm not doing any checking. I'm not avoiding. And I'm teaching my brain, look, I showed up. I'm here. I'm doing the work. I'm not treating myself any different. And I'm accepting all the thoughts, feelings, and sensations. So if you don't do the response prevention, it actually tells your brain that whatever exposure you did could be dangerous and to not do it again. So when we hear clinicians not trained in OCD treatment say, oh, you need to find a therapist with exposure therapy, it's more so that they don't understand that the response prevention is a key component for OCD treatment. How about for you? Because I know it's so important for our personal work and recovery, but also really explain to clients that the response prevention is extremely important.
It's so important. And it's interesting because like what I like to tell people or remind folks is that oftentimes you're actually doing exposures. If you live with OCD, you just aren't doing response prevention. And so an example of that is like if I think a doorknob is contaminated, but my door is shut and I need to leave my room or space, I touch that doorknob. That's an exposure. But if I walk down the hall and wash my hands, I've actually reinforced that doorknob's really dangerous. It's scary. It's not good. And so exposure therapy alone is just not what works for OCD. It has to be exposure with response prevention. And Alec Pollard's statement is, one we all use. We'd much prefer a small E and big RP than a big E and small RP, because at the end of the day, one is going to allow you to change your relationship with anxiety, to teach yourself that message you want to be sending yourself versus the message you talked about, Chris, which is, oh, this is dangerous. This is scary. I can't tolerate this. And so it's just really, really critical. And I think, the thing I want to talk about for a second too, and we talk about this all the time, is that so many individuals feel like exposure therapy or ERP is this like torturous process. It's this fear factor. And it's really not. But what I think is that a lot of times people feel that way because either they're being pushed to do an exposure that's not values-based, that doesn't align with them, or they're doing exposures they're not ready to do yet, right? They're doing exposures that are so challenging, they're not going to be able to engage in response prevention. And so that's why we say we would always rather you do a lower level exposure where you're willing to, right? So tear it down. So if that doorknob is too hard, could you touch a paper towel on that doorknob and touch the paper towel? Could you shake someone's hand after they touch the doorknob? Like, are there ways that you can tear down that exposure and do it fully with response prevention to work yourself up versus you keep doing exposures, but you keep engaging in rituals? Same goes for avoidance behaviors, right? Avoidance plays just as big of a role in the OCD cycle as a compulsion does. And so if we can't get you to stop compulsing, if we can't get you to stop avoiding, we're not going to be able to get you to change your relationship with anxiety and OCD, right? They all go hand in hand always.
Yeah. And I'm glad you said something. I was thinking about our conversations. I was out with a client and we were doing exposures. They have health related exposures, mainly getting sick. So they've been avoiding like public venues, public situations. And there's a mall right by my office, South Coast Plaza, and there's an Apple store. It's always busy. I'm like, and it doesn't matter if it's 2 p.m, noon, 1. I don't know what that means. Is everybody's iPhone stuff breaking down? So they're always there, but it's just a very popular store. And so we were in there. And there's a game called Fruit Ninja, which is like this fun little game, and you can play against somebody. So my client and I are at the Apple store. We're playing Fruit Ninja against each other, and we're done, and we're walking back to the office. And my client was like, I know, people, my therapist that referred me to this IOP told me that ERP may be hard. And he's like, it was tough today. It's the first time I've been in that packed of a store in like years, but I had so much fun. And I always think about the people that talk about ERP being bad and fear factor, and you're making your client stressed. And I'm like, to the outside eye, it just looked like two people having fun on an iPad. To my client, it was like going and facing fears and doing it positively. But going back to the question about, so first I just want to say it can be very fun and it is not cruel. But the second thing is, the way I always handle response prevention is I talk the client through and I say, okay, this is the planned exposure. Knowing what you know about yourself and about the treatment and where you are at it, do you believe, let's list out the things that OCD really wants you to do when we're out there. Do you believe you can refrain from doing those things? That's the response prevention. And if the client is like, yes, I'm ready, we still go and we ease up to it. You know, he and I walked into other stores that weren't as busy, and he was like, I'm ready to go in the Apple store. So if you're getting treatment, make sure your clinician is working with the response prevention, because it is unfun to go and do an exposure, but completely melt down, avoid, and compulse when you're there. It's not going to feel like you learned anything. And if anything, you're going to walk away and say, ooh, that wasn't that great.
We should make shirts that says ERP can be fun. Or
yes, exactly.
But no, we talk about this all the time at the clinic, right? So we run one of the few residential programs in the country. And so a lot of people think it's just like, you come, you live with us, and we're just like doing hard things and torturing you all day long. And it's like, yes, you're doing hard things. Of course, that's a part of treatment, is you're learning you can do hard things. But also, guess what? Even if you didn't have OCD, if you're living your life, if you're growing in your career, if you're growing personally, you're still doing hard things, right? That's just a part of life and growth. But we talk about things we do all the time, like cooking competitions, or last week we had like a Mario Kart competition, and
oh my God,
Valentine's Day cookie decorating, right? But like, exposures can be fun, and they should be something that, like, it shouldn't have to be, if I'm doing an exposure, I'm just sitting in this discomfort and it's terrifying. It should also be exciting.
All I want to let you know is I'm amazing at Mario Kart. So next time you guys have it, I have to come out there, but you have to tell everybody that I have to be Toad, because that's my character.
Okay, fair.
And then I'll come out for sure.
Deal.
But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that you and I have tried to lead in this community with others is just ERP is an extremely effective treatment. I know people ask about other modalities, and I think there's modalities and aspects of modalities that are extremely helpful, and we talk about them all the time. But ERP is the cornerstone of any treatment, because it's asking you to re-engage with things you really care about. And I think when people are trying to discount ERP or put it down, they like to bring up those rare occasions of like, well, a client was told they had to dive in a dumpster and roll in the trash in the dumpster and like sit in there for an hour, and cockroaches were on their legs. And I'm like, where are you hearing these stories, right? Like, so many clients get better just re-engaging in things that they really care about. So, you know, treatment will have discomfortable moments, and anytime we make change in our life in any aspect, it's going to be some turbulence as we make that change, whether it's somebody quitting smoking or moving to the other side of the country. But ultimately, like, overcoming distress, and, you know, you start to learn like, hey, I can handle this. And that's one thing I always reflect with clients, especially my kid clients. I'm like, wow, you're becoming extremely brave, right? And they pick up that language and they're proud of themselves. So overcoming hard and challenging things is something our brain and our body wants to accomplish.
100%. And I think that's it's just so important for you guys listening to really think about this, which is that if ERP for you feels like torture and it doesn't feel like it's getting you to where you want to be, it doesn't feel like values-based and makes sense, you need to talk to your provider about that. Like, ERP should be values-based. Yes, it should be tough, but it also should be fun at times. But even if it's not fun because it's tough and challenging, it should make sense, right? You should be saying, I totally understand why I'm doing this. I know I need to be doing this. This makes sense to get me to where I want to be.
Exactly.
You want to throw the next question, Chris?
Yeah, so we had a pre-submitted question. I like this one because I do get asked this one. Can attending support groups or other informational settings become an obsession? So I think, you know, one of the things that we talk to people about a lot is like, know the disorder. There's great podcasts out there. You host a great podcast. There's so many podcasts that can really help people start to identify and understand what's going on in their head. There's great books out there. Conferences are amazing. Support groups are incredible. But how can people sort of find that line, Liz, where it's helpful and doesn't kind of cross over? Because as we've said a million times, anything can become an obsession and a compulsion in OCD.
Yeah. And again, I want to ask that same question. What is the function, right? So is the function of podcasts and these things truly just like informational, or you love this this host or this author and you really want to hear their stuff and you want to learn? Or is it you're trying to follow a rule book, right? I always talk about when I do presentations or trainings, if I'm doing like trainings to parents, I worry the most about the parents that are like sitting in the front row taking notes of every single thing I say and then asking me for like exact examples of if this happens, what do I do? If this happens, what do I do? Because my answer is usually like, hey, you're kind of missing the point, right? The point is like, can you understand as a whole how we either contribute to our kids' anxiety or not versus I need a guidebook and a rule book for every scenario? Because guess what? Like, I actually can't create that. I'm not going to know every scenario that's going to happen. And so if you feel like there's this kind of absorbing of information that's informational, it's healthy, you want to learn, or you love hearing from Chris and you want to hear what he has to say this week, there's nothing wrong with that. That's great, actually useful and helpful. However, if instead it's the opposite, so if it's like I'm listening to this because I need to know exactly what to do, and it becomes perfectionistic or ritualistic or this like specific guide or rule book or rigid, that's when I would say it's actually not helpful. And the function of it is not to just learn, And so I always ask too, like, could you just put it on as a podcast and listen to it in the car? And like, maybe you catch 70% of it, but it was fun and great and informative. Or is it like, I have to hear every single thing that's said and I have to follow it perfectly and I have to have these rigid rules around it?
Yeah. I mean, always, what is the function? What's the motive? There's a lot of really good information out there, and clients that don't use it as a compulsion, they are so ahead of the game. They've watched these live streams, they've gone to events, and they're meeting other people with OCD, and they're building a support system. And they're just like, I'm really learning that the content of my obsessions is not a reflection on deep desires. I'm understanding response prevention. There was somebody with a similar subtype, and I saw her get better, and it's inspired me. And then I have clients that are like, I need to listen to these things. I can't have OCD. I want to get rid of OCD. Or sometimes it's like, do I really have OCD? Or maybe I'm just a bad person. Let me listen and make sure that what I hear on the podcast is what. So if the whole reason to listen to these things is trying to answer OCD's questions and mitigate and reduce anxiety, it's probably a compulsion. And what you can do is you don't have to, cold turkey anything. Talk with your clinician. Is there a way that you can balance it out? Like you were saying, Liz, or are you going to have to walk away from it as an exposure and listen to it down the road when you can do it in a way that's not compulsive?
Exactly. Yeah. And what I always say is that you typically know, right? So at the end of the day, if you feel like it might be compulsive, then just assume that it might be and do it either don't do it right at all, or make sure that when you do listen, you're listening in a non-rigid or rule-based way.
Absolutely.
Next question, Chris, is nowadays my OCD comes in the form of disturbing mental images. I do response prevention, but I still don't feel good.
Yeah, there was two things. I was going through the list and I put up this question because I think there's two things. I always try to remind people of the DSM definition of OCD, because a lot of times people will hear like, oh, an intrusive thought. But if you look at the DSM and if you really discuss OCD, it can be intrusive mental images, urges, sensations, feelings, etc. So mental images can be part of it. I've worked with people that will like, get the image of like the plane sitting in the 911 towers and just replaying in their head over and over, and it causes them distress. And when we talk about what is response prevention, usually people are trying to do one of two things when they have intrusive mental images. Either they're trying so hard to push it away, ignore, get rid of, which we know what we resist persists, and then they just seem to come back even stronger. Or, they might take that avoidance method, or they're like analyzing it. What does this mean? Who am I? What kind of person has these thoughts? Am I a bad person? I feel guilty. I feel shameful, etc. And once again, we were talking about that earlier with writing down notes about your obsessions. We are trying to learn that these obsessions are not some connection with you, right? They're a mental health condition. And so when we have this visceral reaction, it's just going to loop around and we're going to keep having it. So that response prevention, which is very hard, is to almost like what I like to tell clients is let it play out. Let those images play out. Don't start, don't stop. Almost imagine you're at a friend's house and they're playing on the background. Some clients find it helpful to bring up the images themselves because it takes away that shock value of like being at school, talking to their girlfriend, laughing, eating food, and getting the image. So some people like to bring it on. Others like a more mindful approach of just allowing the thoughts to be there and not engaging. But I think the hardest thing about treatment is in life, we typically want to get a reward after an action, right? Like, I just did something good. I want my reward. what's difficult in treatment and overcoming any mental health condition, this one included, is you're going to do the hard things, you're going to do the great work, and you're going to get those results. They just may not be immediate. So if you're not feeling good, that actually might be a good thing. It means you're probably walking away from those compulsive safety behaviors that immediately give you that gratification but reinforce the cycle. And trust that if you consistently do it, you will see a shift. And that may be hard, but that's what we all kind of recognized when we went through it, is it may take a little bit of time. I always joke with my younger clients, I'm like, I know you want treatment to be like an Amazon 2-hour delivery. Like, I just did the exposure. Why don't I feel great? It may take time, but remember, you're learning throughout this process, and it will have the benefits that you're seeking.
I think this is so important, and I want to just kind of hone in on it for a minute, because a lot of individuals, before you get to ERP therapy, you've done like talk therapy or therapies that do sometimes make you feel good in that moment, right? That like you're going and you like, I think a lot of people have this thought process that like, I'm going to go to therapy and I'm going to leave feeling good, right? I'm going to feel better. I'm going to have things off my shoulders, where oftentimes with OCD treatment, yes, you should feel good eventually, but it may not be immediate, like Chris said, right? Like the reason OCD has become so significant in your life is because we've chased feeling good immediately versus feeling triggered in the short run and feeling good in the long run, right? And so remember that, of course, if you're doing exposures around really difficult images and thoughts that are triggering, it's not going to be enjoyable. Like, it's actually not meant to be enjoyable. But the goal is that eventually we can get you to a place where those thoughts are no longer triggering, right? Those thoughts are no longer loud. They're no longer present. That's going to take time, and we need to be willing to kind of wait that out.
I just want to say real quick, because I don't want people to think OCD treatment is unique in that, when people go to a couples therapist, it is not fun in the beginning to see a couples therapist, because typically what couples may do is sort of bury stuff and just kind of get used to like the struggles in the relationship. They kind of bury stuff and just kind of, numb out to it or don't discuss it. And now you're in couples therapy, couples counseling, and you're bringing up stuff to the surface that may have been ignored for a long time. And in the beginning, it can cause that distress. But in that kind of therapy, bringing it up allows people to get some understanding, some communication to resolve some of those distressors so that the relationship can heal. So a lot of times in any treatment, any kind of therapy, you're bringing up stuff, trauma therapy, etc. So it's not just unique to OCD. You may not feel good right away, but you're learning, you're gaining information, you're learning how to react to OCD in a much different way. You're getting insight into the condition. So but I think the nice thing when I reflect on my own treatment, it wasn't like I didn't feel good for the entire treatment. It was like in the beginning. And then when suddenly I was like seeing my life change in such a positive way, I was leaving the house during the day instead of waiting until the middle of the night when nobody was around so I didn't harm anybody, right? I was like, dude, this is amazing. Keep giving it to me. I can actually see the sunlight. So I think it's good to remember that you get benefits with the work you put in.
100%. And then Chris, at 11:11, somebody asked when we're going to have our next MD on. They had some specific questions about creatine and depression. And so can you remind folks of the new schedule and when you'll be on with a psychiatrist and who?
Yeah, there was a question about creatine and depression. There was a couple other MD questions we've gotten recently. So Spence, I didn't forget about you. I already sent that to our psychiatrist. The psychiatrist will be on next week. So tune in next week. We have a psychiatrist. I'm always bad about the dates. 7 plus 5 is 12. So next Wednesday, the 12th, is when the MD joins us. So they are going to answer the questions. So I already sent that to them, Spence. I was like, can you do a little bit of research on this before we meet? And if you submitted a question, there was like a couple last week when I was with Amy that I submitted. So if you are on here and you're like, hey, I submitted an MD based question, trust me that we are having someone on next week and they'll be able to answer questions. So excited about that.
Awesome. That sounds great. Next question is from at 11:14 my time. How do you process exposure response therapy for serious health issues like heart problems? Are there any methods to get calm when in situations like this? So I think they're asking about kind of how do you navigate ERP when there also is a true medical concern, and how do you work through that?
Yeah, one of the things I don't know about you, Liz, but one of the things I learned very early in my education, and that's why I always tell people, see a trained professional and not a coach, because one of the things that they really pushed in undergrad and graduate school is like, if there is anything else going on, it is imperative as a mental health condition to work with someone's doctor, whatever kind of doctor that is, right? Like collaboration and care is so important. A lot of people need a team. We just talked about an MD. Somebody might be seeing a psychiatrist. It's important for the therapist and the psychiatrist to interact. And so I have dealt with this, right? Like I've dealt with clients that are having tachycardia, high heart rate. And so doing anything that makes them uncomfortable, sometimes even just like showing up to therapy, their heart is racing. There's also obviously people that have real health conditions. The OCD latches on and then they're, thinking they're dying and they're doing all this research, et cetera. And they're like, but Chris, it's a real health condition. So how I navigate both of those things is I always talk to clients in the assessment. One of the things that I always ask is about medical background. Is there anything that as we work together that may come up that causes a problem? And some people have said, yeah, like when I get anxious, I faint or I have heart issues and stuff. And so what I do as a clinician is make sure that before we even start any kind of treatment, I meet with their, often I can't meet in person, but at least we could connect telehealth with their medical provider and just find like what sort of adjustments, if any, do I need to make? And then working from that, right? So when we were going through COVID, a lot of us therapists handled how we did exposures to fit the criteria that made medical sense. We do the same for this. And then the second part of it, if somebody is going through health issues and they need to do OCD treatment around having health related obsessions, once again, I'm going to talk to the doctor, what is exactly that they should be doing for their mental or for their physical health condition. And then normally somebody with OCD is doing beyond that. So the goal of treatment is to get you back to where your doctor suggests, not to have me take over and push you further than you need. So that would be like my big answer, Liz. I don't know if you have some other insight, but I've had this before. Age sometimes comes into a factor. And I had a client who had a racing heart rate all the time. And so met with her doctor. She got on propranolol. We were working together. We worked at a different pace, and working collaborative with her doctor really made that work.
Yeah. So, two things. Number one, we should never ask you to do something that would be unsafe for you and or that would medically not be warranted. So if someone is dealing with a medical condition, I had a recent patient who had undergone a transplant. And so like their contamination abilities or exposures were going to be different than somebody who hadn't undergone a transplant and weren't on the same medications. And I don't want to guess. I don't want to play doctor there. I want to know, what does your doctor say? What does your medical team say is safe versus is unsafe? And we want to fall within those guidelines in that rule book. If you are not sure, right? If we have somebody who's coming to us with OCD triggers around allergies or around heart rate or things like that, we always want you to be seen by a medical professional first, right? We don't want it to become reassurance seeking and repetitive and ritualistic, but we want somebody who is a specialist in that area to lay the guidelines around, this is what's safe, this is what isn't safe, right? This is your level of an allergy, or you don't have an allergy, whatever it might be. And then we're going to treat the anxiety, the things the doctor says is not something to worry about, as anxiety and as OCD. But we definitely want to make sure we have a clear understanding of what that looks like.
Well said. Yeah, it's important.
Next question is my adult, let's see. Okay, we've got a lot. So we'll go to this pre-submitted one first. My adult son lives in our family home. I live overseas with my husband where we built a retirement home. I'm currently staying with my son as he goes through ERP with a therapist, and he also takes medication. Is it better for him to live without me? Doesn't he need to learn how to live on his own?
Yeah, so we did a talk this summer at the conference about lived helplessness and just how important it is to send signals to our loved ones that they do have the skills and the tools to be able to handle hard times. Now, once again, because we haven't, met with you and your son, it's difficult. But what I typically will say is a lot of times when people come to me, especially if they're looking for a higher level of care, which I'm sure you get as well, Liz, is that there is some adjustments in lifestyle, right? Like maybe an adult son is back at home. I'll just use son because I said son. An adult son is back at home. They're currently not in school. They're not working. They're being taken care of, right? Going from that to like, all right, first session, kick them out. They need to get a job by our next session or I'm not going to see them, right? That's just going to be too much of a shock to the system and it's not going to be helpful. But of course, part of the treatment plan is to ensure that the person is starting to become autonomous, independent, being able to take care of themselves and learning to not let not let OCD rather interfere with everything they want to do. So what I'd say is work with the clinician and just say, hey, I want to get back to my home overseas. I want my son to be able to really take care of himself. Can we ensure that the process is allowing us to kind of like hand off who's in charge? I think you talk about it a lot, Liz, like with accommodations for work or accommodations in school, you don't have to rip them day one, but the goal is to eventually phase out those accommodations so people aren't using them to rely. So that would be like my thing, is you don't have to like go home right away if you're providing support for your son while he goes through this, but you don't need to stay with him most likely, through the entire span of treatment. Part of the treatment should be getting him some independence.
100%. And can you plug your support group?
Yeah, so we have a family and loved one support group every second Saturday of the month. Liz has been a guest multiple times. So if you are a family member, if you're a spouse, if you're a partner, if you're somebody who has somebody in your life with OCD, every second Saturday of the month from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific time, so that would be 2 to 4 Eastern time, my mom and I run a free virtual open to anybody family and love one support group. So if you want to get information about that or the link to join, Emilio, if you could put it in the chat, but our email is info@ocdsocal.org. Again, that's info, so info @ocdsocal, SOCAL.org. And it's an opportunity to come this weekend, Liz. We have somebody that works for you that's going to be on there. So I'm so excited. Victoria and her family, Victoria Lake. Yes. Right? So if you can make it to our family group on Saturday, Victoria is a person with OCD who went through treatment and then full circle now treats OCD with Liz at the OCDI in Houston. So it gives people hope that not only can you have OCD, but you can get better, you can go to school, you can graduate, and you can work at one of the premier treatment centers in the world. So I think that's just a success story. And we'll hear from her mom and her dad, what they did to support her. So hopefully you can make it.
Yes, she's so amazing. I love that. Love that. So I will be there. Matthew, I love you sharing your example, and I love just seeing and hearing you guys' progress. So Matthew shared, I've recently been going through a big avoidance trigger, which has been really challenging for the past couple of months, but I've gradually leaned into response prevention step by step and have kept reaching towards my values and why I'm facing my trigger. To which now it's dissipating and remembering that if I can overcome past OCD triggers, I can overcome this too. So I love that. And this reminder that yes, it is hard, right? It is hard for any of us when we go through a trigger, something that's difficult, to walk through it instead of trying to avoid it, walk around it, or ignore it. But the reality is that when we walk through it, that's where we get to see the change and reminding us that we can do hard things, because guess what? You've done them before. So I love that. I love that. So many good questions. Let's hop to the next one that pre-submitted. So with religious and moral OCD, how can CBT or exposure therapy be used? If an obsessive thought is about an immoral action and avoiding that action, what treatments or supports would be best without worsening scrupulosity or checking behaviors?
Yeah. A lot of times people will ask this because, once again, I think there's a lot of misconceptions that Liz and I are constantly trying to bat away about OCD treatment. OCD treatment is not learning how to live out your worst case fear. Liz and I had a talk, I think it was 2002 or 2001 at this point, about that. So a lot of people are fearful about getting OCD treatment because they think it's going to jeopardize their faith. Once again, just like Liz and I were talking earlier about the importance of working with a medical doctor, it is important for us to have a basic understanding of faith. So an example, for instance, is I've worked with clients that have some food-related avoidances because of their faith, whether they're Jewish and there's certain foods they avoid. Obviously, our Muslim friends may avoid things with alcohol and with pork in it. Jewish, are looking for kosher food. I worked with a client who was vegan, and she was terrified to go into any restaurant or any store, any grocery store that had meat in it, because what if it, somehow goes through the packaging, gets on her food, and now she's eating meat, right? So with all of those clients I mentioned, the treatment is not to make the vegan client eat meat, the Muslim client to eat pork and drink alcohol, make the Jewish client to eat, pork and other foods that they don't eat. The goal is to say, what do your community do? What are kind of like the guides that they follow? How come you're living by a different set of rules? How come you are doing things extra? So what I'd say to this client is, if you're having fears that you are going to do an immoral action or you're going to be a bad person, right? That's what OCD is great at. It attacks who you are, it attacks what you care about. It's obviously important for you. Yeah, it may be important to you to not do those things and not to be those things. So OCD is going to attack that and say, hey, what if? And the goal of treatment is not to bat that away. Like Liz just said, it's to power through it. But I just want to give you a little bit of understanding of the treatment. It's not to sit here and make you do those immoral actions, purposely act out on it, and trying to live immorally to learn how to somehow get used to being immoral so you beat OCD. I think that's a huge misconception about treatment.
Yeah, 100%. So I just want to give a couple thoughts. First of all, Katie O'Dunn, one of our amazing IOCDF advocates and has been doing this work for a long time, helps lead up our Faith and OCD conference and many different things that the foundation does, including an entire webpage through IOCDF that focuses on treatment around scrupulosity, also faith-based practices, and just is a wealth of knowledge and information. So definitely check out that content because that's available to you guys. The second piece is that scrupulosity is actually not different, than any other type of OCD. But this is the question I get the most. I always get patients with scrupulosity feeling like, well, it's different, right? Because I don't want to become less faithful. I don't want to be taken away from my faith. And the reality is that treatment should actually allow you to have a healthier relationship with your faith because it removes OCD. It doesn't remove your faith. It should not go against your values. And this is the same for other subtypes. So think about violent intrusive thoughts, sexual intrusive thoughts. We don't want to normalize those thoughts and make you treatment doesn't mean I have to be okay with being a pedophile. God, no. Anybody with OCD that has this trigger would say, I'm not interested in that. No, thank you. That goes against my morals, against who I am. These thoughts terrified me. What treatment should do, though, is it should allow you to see that that is an unwanted intrusive thought. That is your OCD. That is not you. And it's very different when we're talking about OCD where there's no intent, there's no plan to act on it. It's the fear of what if, right? It's these unwanted intrusive thoughts that come up that we want to be able to get rid of. And so we do treatment, but again, treatment doesn't mean we have you do something I wouldn't be willing to do. We don't have you do things that are inappropriate, that are immoral, that are taboo, things that all of us wouldn't do. We have you do things that you wish you could do, but that you've been avoiding. So hang out with your niece, go to a store where kids might be present, do things that anybody else would do if they don't have this type of OCD or this type of trigger, not something that's actually dangerous or actually taboo or actually scary, right? And things that your OCD might make you think are scary. And so that's really important to note. And it's the same with scrupulosity, right? I'm not going to ask you to engage in blasphemy or to do something that goes against your faith or against something that you would be comfortable with. But what I am going to ask you to do is I'm going to often say something like, if you didn't have OCD, what would you be doing? And many times for people with scrupulosity, they've actually quit going to church, quit engaging with their faith practices, right? They've stopped reading the Bible or reading scripture, right? Or doing these things that are important to them because it's triggering for them. But if they didn't have OCD, they would really want to be doing that, right? That might be really important to them. They would love to draw a cross or, whatever it might be. And so that's what we want to get you back to. And so I think that is just such a big misconception of ERP is that we're going to ask you to do things that you wouldn't want to do or that somebody else wouldn't do. And I will simply say things like, well, would your family member do this? What would be things that they would be doing or that you would be doing if you didn't have OCD, or that they do that you wish you could do, right? That's what we want to get you back to. And that's what treatment should be about.
Yeah. And what I would say is what I see all the time, you just made a great point. If people give into OCD for a long time around the obsessions around morality and faith, typically, like Liz just said, they're not engaging in their faith-based practices. They've given up the text that they normally read. They're not showing up to certain religious events, right? And they're avoiding it. And typically when they go through treatment, quite the opposite ends up occurring. They reconnect with their faith. They're starting to enjoy it again. It's not a place of intense anxiety. So I think people just got to remember that, hey, you actually get back what you've lost doing the treatment. Vice versa doesn't work. You don't get it back when you do enough compulsions, right?
Agreed. Agreed on all. Next question, Chris, before we hop into more questions, somebody asked, they were a little bit confused of when you said the support group is. So can you repeat time and date of your family support group every month?
Oh yeah, I see that from Joy. So Joy, thanks for asking. The Family and Loved Ones OCD support group, it's virtual and free. We actually meet the second Saturday of every month. So this Saturday, February 8th, we meet 11 to 1 here on the West Coast PT time. On the East Coast, that's 2 to 4 p.m. So yes, 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern time, you're correct, but it's every second Saturday of the month, with this Saturday falling on the 8th. So anybody can email info@OCD SoCal and we'll send you the link, and we hope you can join us this Saturday.
100%. Yes. And it's great. And get that in your standing and recurring calendars, you guys, because it's an awesome support group.
Yes, and you're going to be on again. I always ask you because I love you. Can I ask you this question? Because I think you have the best answer for this. So somebody had submitted that their daughter is just diagnosed with severe OCD. She's going to start a program. This is new to her family. Obviously, like when people are coming, I know you guys do more than just residential. You have PHPs, IOPs, and stuff. What can, like, whether it's somebody watching who's a family and loved one, or it's somebody with OCD, like, what can people expect? Because I know when I refer people to you or to, a higher level of care, there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of fear, a lot of overwhelm. So if somebody is about to start on their treatment journey and maybe they're doing a little bit higher level of care than just simply outpatient once a week, like what can people expect? How should people prepare? What can that look like for people as they start?
Yeah, and I'm actually going to kind of go through all levels of care. So traditional outpatient care is typically what we would call like once a week, a 45-minute session. And what we would say is that in 12 to 16 sessions, so this is kind of average, right? You should see a huge difference and great outcomes. With that being said, progress is not always linear, right? Sometimes it's better and worse. We're doing harder things. We have a harder week. It can kind of ebb and flow. And also to note that it is not always at your speed. And so oftentimes family members will say things like, oh, my loved one's not getting better. And the loved one will say, yes, I am. I'm doing a lot of great new things. But maybe the things they're working on or what they're most motivated to do first aren't the things the family members might notice, or the things that the family members might want them to work on, or the things that actually are at the last or least of priority on their totem pole. So it's really important to have open lines of communication of what are you working on, and to be able to acknowledge the things that they do. I think one of the biggest things I see in therapy from family members is saying things like, oh, but you're still doing this, right? They're noticing the rituals they're still doing. And that's so hard on individuals with OCD, where they're like, but here's all the things I'm not doing anymore. And can we recognize that? I will tell you, I had a recent trigger, and I haven't been triggered in a really long time, but my husband had a really bad health scare, and there was some contamination stuff that had happened. He ended up getting like sepsis from an IV bag that was bacteria and whatever. And so it really triggered my OCD, and I managed it. Like I worked through it. I didn't do rituals around it, but I was triggered by it, right? It was still like activating for me. And I remember when I was talking to Matt about it, his immediate response was like, how do I fix this? Oh my gosh. And I was like, Matt, like, you can't go into fixing it mode. Like, I have to work through this, and I'm working through it. I'm just sharing it with you of like, if I'm a little bit disconnected today, or if I feel like, if it seems like I'm a little bit off, this is just why. Like, I'm triggered by it, but I'm working through it, right? I don't have zero triggers. Like, they still happen, even though, again, like, haven't had a trigger like this in a couple years. And one of the things I said to him is I said, I've been doing really awesome, and I haven't really been triggered. And just because I'm triggered, I don't need you to respond as though it's a bad thing, right? Triggers actually aren't always bad. It's how I respond to it. If all of a sudden now the house is contaminated and I'm asking everybody to do rituals, yeah, that's a problem. But if I'm just triggered, but I'm able to move through it, that's actually amazing. And like, that's something we should be honoring and talking about and be excited about. But it's hard and it's scary as family members too, because you're so worried about reverting back, right? Or what progress will look like. So be really thoughtful about how you recognize, how you talk about progress, and how you validate your loved one while they're going through treatment and doing these hard things. If somebody is doing traditional outpatient therapy, so that once a week session, and they're not getting better, there's a couple things I want to ask. Number one, are they with the right clinician? So is the clinician they're with appropriately trained in ERP, appropriately specialized in OCD, and have had appropriate background and training? Number two, do they have a good rapport with that clinician, right? You can have an amazing clinician who's very well qualified, but if you don't mesh with them and you don't have a good working relationship, you're probably not going to trust them enough to be able to do these really hard and vulnerable things. So that's something we want to talk about as well. But number three, which is always kind of often the bigger one, is this the right level of care? Somebody with really severe OCD, traditional outpatient therapy might not be enough. They might need to step up to an intensive outpatient program, which is often something like 2 to 3 days a week. Maybe they need a partial hospitalization program, so something like 3 to 5 days a week, 3 hours or more a day. Or maybe they need a higher level of care, which is something like residential, like we have at OCDI Texas, McLean Boston, and Rogers. In Ascension, there's a couple programs in the country that have some OCD specific residential programs where you're living 24/7 with individuals and with support that is specific to OCD and OCD treatment. So you want to really make sure you're with the right provider doing the right evidence-based intervention, which is ERP, that they have specialty background and training. And then B, you want to make sure you're in the right level of care. So when I was first diagnosed, my OCD continued to get worse. I didn't get good treatment. And so by the time I was getting good treatment, I needed residential level of care, which is what I got when I was 15. Outpatient, even with a great provider, would not have been sufficient. It doesn't mean I wouldn't have benefited a little bit or learned, but I wouldn't have been able to get to a place of functioning and freedom from my OCD from that level of care, because my OCD was just too severe, right? I would have gone to therapy once a week and gone home and ritualized. And so the question is, can you go to therapy and maintain progress and continue making progress throughout the week? Or do you kind of fall apart in between those therapy sessions? And does your OCD really run rampant in between? If so, I'd want to consider if this is the right level of care.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, unfortunately, when I was getting treatment, the only higher level of care was at UCLA in the area. And they had a 1.5 year waiting list. So I had to do once a week, and I was super severe. I think I was like a 36 or something on the white box. I will tell people, if you can get a higher level of care, it is game changing. It is really, my treatment was a very long treatment because I didn't have the right level of care. So I think now we have a lot more options. So I hope if you're connecting with your clinician and the treatment is making sense, but it's just not working the way that it should, because there's so many hours in between your sessions, think of a higher level of care for sure.
Yeah. So next question that people are submitting live from L is, I've been coming off Paxil and have a really hard time dropping an anchor, if you will, when my thoughts are spiraling. I find going on runs can help, but do you have any suggestions for when I'm in school and have already gone on a daily run?
Yeah. So, Elle, one of the things that we always talk about too is like adjunctive things that we can do to take care of ourselves. We know that things like runs, getting good sleep, eating well, et cetera, isn't going to be the premier treatment, right? The primary thing to treat OCD. But you can fight back against your OCD and use the tools you're getting for your clinician a lot better if you're taking care of yourself. And so for a lot of people, they find that runs or exercise is helpful. What I would first say is, at school, sometimes why it can be such a trigger is either your OCD is around school, maybe perfectionistic perfectionism about reading or taking notes, etc. So you would really work with your clinician to tack that in treatment. So I have clients bring in their laptops. We do work together in session to really help address that. Let's say it's not that. Your OCD has nothing to do with school, but maybe you're in a class that's bored and your mind's just kind of wandering. What I work on with clients is learning, like, when is it a mental compulsion? When are you kind of going to that crossover point from like obsession to like rumination, right? Like you walk in with a thought and you're spending the whole class thinking about it. What can you do to, address those mental compulsions? If that's not it, and you're just finding yourself really just uncomfortable and struggling when you're in class and there's not a lot going on, I personally would say you're already taking care of a run, right? That's going to help you address it. Let's say you've done your run, you're doing all your treatment, and you're still feeling uncomfortable. Because a lot of times it's not even necessarily intrusive thoughts. Sometimes we're just anxious or uncomfortable, etc. What I personally found that helped me is just mindfulness and presence. I always found that whenever I was uncomfortable in like school, for instance, it was because I was tuned out into the world around me and in my head, and just kind of running scenarios, thinking about things. Sometimes it wasn't even necessarily OCD based, maybe more general anxiety of like, when I leave here, what do I have next? What do I have to do? And whenever I just got back to the present moment, noticed what my professor was wearing, noticed how the seat felt on my back, it helped ground me. But I will say, what I would want you to do, Elle, is talk to your therapist about what's coming up in school. And is it something either triggering, or is it just the kind of time that you can sort of space out and ruminate in your head causing the problem? The run will definitely help, address some of that like intense anxiety, but it's not going to address the OCD itself. And that may be the problem.
Bingo. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better, Chris. I think that it is so critical for us to remember that what we don't want to do is try to just suppress anxiety and thoughts. So, yes, like this can be helpful in the moment to help you move through the day, to help you get to class. Like that's awesome. And we need to actually address why you're being triggered, right? What thoughts are still showing up? Why are you spiraling? Can we actually do active ERP around that? Because what I don't want is people to think that OCD treatment means we're always going to have triggers, we're always going to be spiraling, and we just have to figure out how to move through that. That's actually what we call white knuckling, right? That's kind of this like, I have to survive through this trigger, I have to survive through this difficult time, versus actually, I want you to get to a place where you have thoughts, but they're not triggers, right? Where you are not in a place where you are constantly triggered, where you're constantly trying to push through. We want you to be able to fully live your life.
Yeah.
And
And what I
truly
would
be there.
Yeah, what I was going to add really, really quick too is sometimes when, it's finding out, I always tell people like runs and stuff, like we said earlier, don't let that be compulsive, right? Like a run is like a general way to manage your angst and your anxiety. But what is really going to help is everything that we just talked about and what Liz just said for sure.
So last question, we'll go to a pre-submitted question was, what is the best strategy for dealing with feeling that you'll always struggle with OCD and that even when things are good, they will eventually get bad again? This question makes me sad. So I want us to talk a lot about this one.
Yeah, what I would always say is like, I think when I look back to my recovery journey, there was always forward momentum, because sometimes I'll hear people like, oh, I've had bouts of ERP. I don't think it works for me. Like I did it for like 2 years when I was like 19 and I did it for 4 more years, etc. That wasn't my experience. I mean, my experience was, yes, I was in treatment a long time, but what I'm saying is there's no right pacing, but even if it felt slow moving at times, it was always moving forward. But it wasn't just like getting back life behaviorally. I was getting a lot more insight. I was knowing how to cognitively address certain things. I was getting a different mindset. So what I'd say is if you're feeling a little bit helpless, I mean, I've seen so many great people, like thank goodness for the community, right? I've been reading all the comments, and if you ever see me look off, it's because I'm reading comments. So many people have talked about stepping things up and fighting and working hard and getting better and everything. So I tell people like it may be a process, especially if you're in a severe case, especially if you're a severe case and you're not able to get the level of care, but you should be getting hope. You should be moving forward. You should be seeing yourself re-engaging in life, having more clarity of thought, right? So if you feel like it's just always struggling, I would really talk to to your therapist and say, I don't feel hopeful in what we're doing. I will say as a clinician, what I usually do is if I have a client that I feel like we're not moving as quickly, I check in with them, right? We kind of like brainstorm together. Lastly, for the second half, when people fear that it's going to get bad again, when we go through any experience in life, it changes us forever. I have a good friend that went through cancer treatment, and we were talking the other day late night. We were just kind of FaceTiming, and she's like, I feel like I'm forever changed from that process. It was horrible. I don't want to go through it again. But she's like, I just find myself letting go of the small stuff and really, engaging in life. Whenever we go through an experience, our life changes. And when we go through treatment, we've gone through OCD, we go through the treatment, you're forever changed. You have a new set of skills, a new set of tools. You have an understanding of what OCD looks like. You have insight on your triggers and the way that OCD works. So trust that if you go down the road and you're living your best life and OCD tries to creep in, you will have learned so much, and those tools are going to help you moving forward, and you can manage it for sure.
100%. And I just think that, we talk all the time about ERP treatment should get you to freedom. And for many of you listening, I want to validate that feels super far fetched, right? And for many of you, you may be like, that doesn't seem like reality. That's okay. And so we've talked before as well that ERP should get you to functioning first. And then once you're starting to function better and you're living your life again the way that you previously couldn't, you're going to want more. You're going to want those relationships to be free from OCD, not just functional with OCD. You're going to want work to be something that you can do and thrive and enjoy versus you kind of do it, but you do it while still having some OCD. And so sometimes too, freedom is gradual, but it's this progression, right? It's not always like I have OCD, I get treatment, I get freedom in this short period of time. It becomes like a stepping stones, right? You learn, you improve, you grow. I know for me, both as a clinician and my own personal experience with OCD, and I think Chris, you've shared the same for you. I grow every day. I learn something new. I understand things different. It clicks in a different way. I have different aha moments. Like there's not just one thing that happened that it was like, oh, all of a sudden, boom, it was done. It's like you're constantly learning and evolving and growing and understanding it differently and better and all of the above. And so I think, though, if your treatment to date has left you feeling like things are eventually going to be bad again, and that I know I'm always going to struggle, I want to push you on that. I want to push you to think about doing treatment differently and to think about finding a different treatment provider, because treatment should not, if you are feeling like OCD treatment and OCD recovery means I'm always going to struggle with OCD, we are not at the right place. And maybe we're not at the right place mentally for ourselves because we've accepted that. And so we're holding on unintentionally, or maybe we're not at the right place from a treatment perspective with the right provider or the right treatment team. And that needs to be adjusted. But no matter what, you should not have to settle for always struggling because you have an OCD diagnosis. And that's what all this work is for. Like Chris and I would, we don't do this. If struggling is something you would have to accept, this would be a really terrible job and also a really terrible volunteer experience for us to be doing. Like we do this because we want you to know and to believe and to see firsthand that that is not the truth, that effective treatment, the way you engage in effective treatment won't just change and save your life. It will allow you to have a completely different perspective, understanding of anxiety and OCD beyond, by the way, what people without OCD will ever have. And freedom truly is possible with the right treatment.
Mic drop moment. Mic drop moment. I mean, so true. I think that people, that's the good thing about what people hear from Victoria this Saturday if they come, or clients that have gone to your treatment center. You will hear from people that they are not only living their life now, but they're thriving. And they're appreciative of the hard work they put in. They enjoyed the process of standing up to something that was crippling, and they're in a good place. And now they want to help others. I think that's why there's so many advocates out there, because people are just like, look, you can get better. There's been messaging out there. You're going to suffer forever. It's chronic, but you can get better. So I think it's important for you, Liz, and for everyone to keep spreading that message so people know that they can truly, truly live a very fulfilled life.
100%. It's possible, and we wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't. So thank y'all for joining. I love seeing you guys. I'll be back in a month, but you are with Chris every week, which is so amazing. And I love watching the live streams and seeing how this program has evolved, and can't wait to see you guys soon.
And we'll see 2 new babies.
Yes.
Bye, everyone. Take care. Join us again next week.